Before this episode begins, over the next couple of months, I am looking specifically for parents, educators, and librarians whose lives or whose children's lives have been personally impacted by book bans. If you have a story you are willing to share publicly and to appear on camera using a first-name basis, please reach out to bookfairpod@gmail.com, subject line Banned Books Week. Welcome to the Book Fair Podcast. My name is Anthony, and the new school year is underway. This week we have a new picture book translation, a look at the new Massachusetts law protecting access to books, Colorado rejects a Texas-focused curriculum, and a Canadian library estimates adopting systems to comply with recent book banning laws will cost local taxpayers $100,000. Coming this Friday, we will have an interview with Barbara Carroll Roberts, author of When George Washington Bowed to the New Nation. But first, let's begin by looking at new releases, starting with I Am a Leaf by Angelo Mozzillo, translated by Denise Muir. In Mozzillo's mercurial picture book, a seasonal symbol of impermanence communicates the mutability of circumstances and feelings. Alongside frequently rhyming declarations, photographs of crisp autumnal leaves mingle with minimalist charcoal-like drawings to acknowledge the highs and lows of a child whose skin tone echoes the white of the page. In one scene, a leaf becomes a hammock. In another, an umbrella. Elsewhere, one day an escapade attends an image of the child wearing a leaf like a hang glider on the facing page. One day, a bit afraid, finds them hiding behind the leaf. Later, the figure dons a leaf like a turban to stroll through the bazaar, pinpointing the book's broader aim. Closing lines sagely center on an individual's need to freely evolve. Change is natural, suggest the creators of this introspective book of opposites. This book is recommended for ages 4 to 7. Next is A Very Good Parade by Eleanor Davis. Cartoonist Davis makes a triumphant solo picture book debut with the tale of an assertive child who wills a parade into being. Holding a spatula scepter and sporting a tutu and a starred cape, young Gabby, portrayed with brown skin, marches up to her bemused grandmother and declares, "It's time for a parade." As the two head out their front door, down the block from an elevated train, minimalist narration alternates with dialogue balloons of Gabby's take charge exchanges with neighbors. Whatever you've got, you have to join the parade. The assemblage gathers steam through Gabby's inclusive curation and simple problem-solving. Energetic artwork in a sharp, limited palette swings from spare vignettes that spotlight Gabby's recruitment process to full-bleed cityscapes that swell with the ragtag procession of kids portrayed with various abilities and skin tones. The event culminates with a marvelous racket of performance, and even Miguel, saddled with a tuba he can't tootle, manages a glorious barumpa before everyone heads home for dinner. Uncorking the joy latent in an ordinary day, it's a big-hearted ode to come-as-you-are community and a child who refuses to march alone. This book is recommended for ages 4 to 8. Next is Little Monsters by Máire Roche. Putting a contemporary supernatural twist on Little Women proves the springboard for a gripping, heartwarming story from Roche, her children's debut. Each fair-skinned March sister has a monstrous secret. 13-year-old Meg's stress about looking out for her siblings manifests in razor-sharp claws and teeth. 12-year-old Joe sprouts fur during full moons. 11-year-old Beth conceals bat wings beneath ill-fitting sweaters, and 10-year-old Amy grows a tail while submerged in salt water. Desperate for acceptance and keen to avoid suspicion, the girls hide these traits from their foster mother. When rumors spread of a fanged, clawed monster terrorizing their Salem, Massachusetts hometown, Meg, a sleepwalker who has been noticing gaps in her memory, worries that she may be inadvertently harming her neighbors. As Halloween nears and the attacks intensify, Meg uncovers settling truths that paranormal happenings run deep throughout Salem's history. Empathetic third-person narration closely follows Meg, whose anxious, overburdened persona lends the novel emotional immediacy, while thoughtfully examining the strain of secrecy and longing for community on the girls' relationships. This innovative offering quickly establishes its own distinctive identity, blending monster mythology with coming-of-age themes to deliver an affectionate spin on Alcott's classic. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. The final title for this week is Bound by Fury by Noelle Monét. Debut author Monét conjures a gripping romantasy in which a grieving teen is thrust into a decades-old magical Appalachian war. As Black 16-year-old Harper mourns her grandmother Gigi's sudden death, she learns that Gigi's bedtime stories about pretty brown girls with magic in their blood are real. What's more, Harper is descended from a long line of witches with connections to Gigi's alma mater, the Black Mountain Academy, an elite boarding school in the Appalachian Mountains that's rumored to be haunted. Upon arrival, Harper searches for answers about the women and her own developing powers. Simultaneously, Harper's dreams increasingly feature past events and figures that urgently guide her on an investigation into her family history that uncovers deadly secrets about shady land dealings, stolen power, and a magical inheritance. A simmering, unpredictable love triangle heightens narrative suspense, leaving both Harper and the reader guessing whether romance or betrayal awaits. Intermittent chapters set in 1926 North Carolina gradually reveal the history behind Harper's present-day reality. Exceptional world-building, emotionally charged prose, and an intricately layered, delightfully disorienting mystery foster sustained engagement. The resultant offering culminates in a nail-biting introduction to a promising new talent. This title is recommended for ages 14 and up. That covers the new releases for this week. Next, we'll be taking a look at some news. But first, if you appreciate the work being done on the Book Fair podcast, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show out to new listeners. Second, you can follow the podcast on Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok at BookFairPod. You can also go to patreon.com/thebookfair to find episodes posted early as well as links to news sources used throughout the show. Following on Patreon is free and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Now, on with the show. Next, let's take a look at news, starting with a look at the newly signed anti-book ban law in Massachusetts. Last week on the Book Fair podcast, we covered a recently passed bill in Massachusetts that would protect against book bans. As of recording last week's episode, the bill was still awaiting a signature from Governor Máire Healey. However, before that episode was released, that bill had been signed into law. Now, taking a look at another publication, the Cape Cod Times, let's dive deeper into the new law and how it will impact public and school libraries. SB 3241 states that no book can be removed from a school library unless there is first a notice, a public hearing, and a vote by a review committee made up of school personnel. The committee must find that the material is devoid of any educational, literary, artistic, personal, or social value, which we mentioned last week. The law also limits who can challenge a book to school staff, parents, guardians, and students. This will combat the issue seen in Florida, where famously one man filed over 1,000 challenges across the state. Additionally, students, parents, and guardians will be able to contest the committee's decision to remove a book through the courts, seeing an inverse of the frightening practice of imposing fines on school librarians. For libraries, SB 3241 also outlines a process for adding or removing books in public libraries. Similar to other laws, both restricting and protecting library access, this law requires local libraries to develop policies for the selection of materials as well as the process to respond to any challenges to remove or restrict access to books. However, instead of leaving local libraries out to dry, the Board of Library Commissioners is directed to assist those libraries with developing policies, avoiding ambiguity, and strengthening the relationship between local libraries and the state boards that govern them. The bill also says that library materials should not be selected, prescribed, or removed based on personal, political, or doctrinal disapproval or bias. Authors of specific materials will also be given the power to appeal any decision to remove their own work from public libraries to the Superior Court of Massachusetts. Our next story comes from Canada, where book ban legislation has been making its way across British Columbia. Catching up, since it hasn't been covered much on the Book Fair podcast, Dan Williams, Alberta's Minister of Municipal Affairs, recently set out to ensure that children and young teens can't access sexually graphic materials in books at public libraries, describing his solution as the adult section of old video rental stores, where a separate room was made for pornography, which implies that books not appropriate for young readers are pornographic in nature. Williams introduced Bill 28, the Municipal Affairs and Housing Status Amendment Act of 2026, without consulting Alberta's public libraries or educators about the minister's proposed book ban legislation, which Williams asserts is not a book ban. Now, with the bill pushed by BC's United Conservative Party being signed into law as of May of this year, it requires separating access to explicit materials from spaces accessible to minors. And now, the St. Albert Public Library Board estimates it will have to add an additional $100,000 to next year's budget to comply with the new law. According to the minutes of a recent meeting, Chief Executive Officer of St. Albert Public Library Board, Laura Winton, advised that the proposed Bill 28 allocation is a placeholder pending the release of regulations. These regulations require library staff to determine which books must be held in a secure storage area inaccessible to people under the age of 16, which will require the construction of new walls within Alberta public libraries. Winton told publication The Tyee, I'm not sure if that's pronounced correctly, by the way, it's Tyee, quote, "As we continue our planning and receive additional provincial guidance, our understanding of the implementation requirements and associated costs may continue to evolve." End quote. The article is available at patreon.com/thebookfair, and I would highly recommend reading it just to see how reporting is done in Canada and how it compares to those in America. There's no paywall behind the Patreon page, it's just there since including links in the episode descriptions typically harms discoverability for podcasts. Our next story comes from Texas, where an activist removed from a school board meeting has filed a lawsuit against the district. In an effort to maintain fair reporting, this story is one that opposes my personal views. As an individual recently removed from a Houston Independent School District board meeting, after voicing their opposition to the inclusion of materials they deemed explicit in school libraries. Conservative activist Bonnie Wallace spoke during public comment on March 19th at a board meeting that included an agenda item on instructional materials and library content. Wallace warned that her remarks would include explicit language and suggested that any children present leave the room. She began reading from A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas, a book that her complaint claims is on shelves of at least 3 Houston ISD school libraries and contains graphic, sexual descriptions. With the topic of book bans and advocating for the freedom to read, I have no problem personally acknowledging that this series by Sarah J. Maas, which is frequently challenged in schools, is legitimately not appropriate for young readers. However, there is a process for properly filing challenges for materials, and if that process is followed, I have no problem with a book that is genuinely not appropriate being removed from school libraries. However, Bonnie Wallace chose to make a public display to voice her opposition. As Wallace read the book in question, board president Angela Lemond Flowers interrupted her and issued several warnings, which Wallace dismissed that the language was the point of her criticism. Wallace ultimately stopped and returned to her seat. Board President Flowers directed 3 police officers to remove Wallace from the meeting and escort her out of the building and off district property. Wallace was not charged with any crime, but the complaint notes that Texas law makes it an offense to intentionally disrupt a lawful meeting, despite Wallace using the time she was allotted during public comment. While Bonnie Wallace is an activist fighting for censorship in schools, the removal from the board meeting was wrong. While the lawsuit is the main focus of this article, the problem I have is that it does not mention if Wallace ever filed a formal challenge with the Houston Independent School District. Next, another update from a previous story, this time from Wyoming, where the Fremont County Library System attempted to push through controversial book banning policies. Back in May, we covered that the Fremont County Library System Board of Trustees had put forward a new library materials acquisition policy aimed at protecting children from explicit material, sending it to the required 45-day public hearing right before going on break. The board was attempting to rush through this policy before 2 board members' terms ended. Now, the board has returned with new members, and recently voted to abandon the proposed revision. The public review of the policy was plagued by technical issues, preventing emails to be sent, leading to a delay in the vote before the recent decision to reject the policy. Christy Richmond, one of the 2 newly appointed members of the library board, originally proposed indefinitely postponing any further work on the acquisition policy. Richmond said, quote, "It's not my work, and I in particular do not feel that the proposed changes clarify or resolve any of the issues that it's intended to address." End quote. Our final news story from this week comes from Colorado, where a school district has rejected a new curriculum made for Texas that includes biblical texts. One major news story over this summer was the Texas State Board of Education approving a new mandated reading list for public schools that included biblical stories as part of required reading for K-12 students throughout Texas. While the reading list is not yet required, as it will not be official until 2030, organizations that build curriculums and sell course materials for public schools have begun building and promoting updated products and services that include the Texas reading material. Montezuma Cortez, a small school district in Colorado, opted with Bluebonnet, a curriculum built for Texas students with very little public discussion over the selection and without a vote from the school board. Shortly into the first week of school, the Montezuma-Cortez School Board voted 4-3 to drop the new curriculum. The vote came shortly after the district's superintendent pledged that biblical material would be removed from lessons. Board President Laura DeWitt said at a board meeting that she looked at some of the Bluebonnet materials and found, quote, robot errors, or mistakes, probably generated by AI. A story about a Japanese man who visited Houston to plant rice in 1904 included a map that shows Houston next to the Florida Panhandle instead of inside Texas. While not within the scope of the Good News segment, errors such as these are leading to the Texas Education Agency looking to spend $8.4 million to correct mistakes in the state's curriculum. The main focus here is that the programs built for Texas are available for other states to use, and in Colorado, one school district quickly corrected, pulling Bluebonnet from their schools. Adding a small note, while I didn't have time to script this, there have also been other stories from Kentucky of AI-generated course materials that are being used within schools with inaccurate or illegible materials. I will likely be covering some of that next week. This will conclude another episode of the Book Fair podcast. Coming this Friday, we will have an interview with Barbara Carroll Roberts, author of When George Washington Bowed to the New Nation. If you'd like to help the Book Fair podcast grow, you can go to patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free, and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. You can find links to news sources, as well as episodes posted early. Simply add the RSS feed to your preferred podcast platform. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.